Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Here to wish you a very happy Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and The Smiths. And for this week's episode, we're going to be taking a look at an article dated June 2023, an article I do remember seeing at some point last year, probably around the same time it came out. And if you judge this article by its name, I would accuse it of being somewhat misleading. The article is called Morrissey Names 8 Bands He Hates the Most from the Heart. Now, truth be told, this isn't even really what I would call an article. This is more of a compilation, very brief commentaries that Morrissey has made about some of his fellow artists, over the last many years. I also think it's misleading in the sense that never once in this article does, Morrissey use the word hate. Never once are his remarks meant to be overly personal. I think most of his observations are fairly benign. There are a couple instances, where he sort of flexes his talons. But really, I don't think there's anything that's, over the line. There are a couple artists on this list that really surprised me. So I thought it'd be fun this week to take a look at these 8 artists and find out what Morrissey finds so objectionable about them as we go through Morrissey's list. I have constructed a list of my own of 8 of my least favorite artists of all time. Now, in the spirit of how Morrissey usually approaches this, I am not going to make my attacks on these artists overly personal. I am not a big fan of negativity, especially negativity in this sort of arena. Now, at one time in my life, I could be accused of being kind of a curmudgeon, a very sort of negative creep. But those are habits that I have tried to break over the years. And when it comes to this channel and my love of music, I really try to focus, on the positive. Yes, there are artists I don't like. There are lots of artists I don't like, as a matter of fact. But for the most part, I try to focus, most of my attention on the positive. Music in my life has been nothing but a positive. I'm not being overly dramatic when I suggest that music has saved my life. Probably multiple times. I'm eternally grateful for music. I'm eternally grateful for my fandom of music and what little knowledge I store up here in my little pea brain. So as I go through my list, I'm going to make it a point not to make any of these criticisms personal. They aren't meant to be personal in any way, shape, or form. Like I said, I love music. That's why on this channel I spend most of my time praising the music that I love. This channel is all about the love of music. It's not about, dragging people through the muck. And these artists on my list, like I said, this is not meant to be personal. If you like any of these artists that I mentioned on my list, there's probably a place in your town where you can go and get your ears checked if you'd like. Anyway, the first name on Morrissey's list is one that does not really surprise me. It is Canadian crooner Michael Bublé. Now, I'm not going to read the entire article here to you today, but I will give you sort of the cliff notes as to what Morrissey says about each of these artists. For Michael Bublé, basically, Morrissey accuses him of being nothing more than a stuffed shirt. According to the article, Michael Bublé originally was quite flattered that Morrissey even knew who he was. He sort of shrugged off the criticism that Morrissey leveled at him, but later admitted that it did bother him that Morrissey kind of went after him. He said that Morrissey is somebody he has a tremendous amount of respect for. Now, for me, I'm not overly familiar with the music of Michael Bublé. I do remember hearing some of his Christmas music around the holidays at my grandmother's house, many years ago. I know she is a big Bublé fan. Apart from that, I don't really know anything about his music. Yeah, and what I've heard, I think is pretty rough. I think Michael Bublé is somebody who, tries to fancy himself as being sort of a Sinatra-esque type crooner, but the big difference is that Sinatra was just a badass. Sinatra was the king of cool. In my opinion, I am a huge Frank Sinatra fan, so really comparing anybody to Frank Sinatra is quite a dangerous proposition, at least in my opinion, especially, some cheeseball Canadian crooner. The one thing about Michael Bublé I do remember listening to is his voice is rough. He's very saccharine. Just listening to the records that my grandma put on around Christmas kind of gave me a toothache, to be perfectly honest with you. So this is not one that really surprised me as far as, Morrissey's concerned. I don't even really consider, Michael Bublé to be really even worth mentioning, but it was somebody that Morrissey apparently took a couple of stabs at in the press. For me, number 8, or at least the 8th one on my list. These aren't in any particular order on my list. I should also preface my list by saying the bands or the artists on my list are at least people that I respect enough to consider genuine artists, genuine musicians. You're not going to find anybody, on my list like Good Charlotte, New Kids on the Block, Britney Spears, Taylor Swift, anything like that. So I will say that at least the artists on my list I give enough respect to at least say that these are legitimate artists. So the first artist that I picked, I think this band is from New York, or they at least formed in New York, and they are called Dream Theater. Now, I am not really a big fan of progressive rock in general, but this is a band that, to me, they take it way too far to the extreme. I remember back in like the mid to late 2000s, I had a really good friend. I was living in Seattle. I had a really good friend who loved prog rock. He was the Rush guy. Rush was his band. He was probably the most obsessed with a band person I've ever met in my entire life. He literally ate, sleep, and drank Rush. But apart from Rush, he loved all sorts of prog rock. He loved anything that was technical. He loved, death metal and grindcore, anything that was really super technical. Now, he and I went to go see Rush together one time in Seattle at the Key Arena. Like I said, I'm not a big Rush fan. As far as that style of music goes, I think I can handle Rush as much as I can sort of handle, anybody. I'm just not big into prog rock. I just never have been. But we went and saw Rush. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. It's interesting at least. It's not really my luggage, but, I thought it was listenable. Of course, I know a bunch of Rush's material. I do own some Rush records, not that I listen to them very often, but with a band like Dream Theater, they take it to the absolute extreme. To me, this music, it's just basically guitar masturbation. To me, there's nothing that's really conveyed in the music apart from its technicality, apart from, basically, showing off their musicianship. And of course, these guys in Dream Theater are tremendous musicians. I would never take that away from them. But really, that's my issue when it comes to anything that gets overly proggy. Now, that same friend and I, in June of 2020, or no, in June of 2010, I think it was, he and I went to go see Dream Theater open for Iron Maiden. Well, actually, I guess that's not really accurate. I think it was a co-headlining tour with Dream Theater and Iron Maiden. Dream Theater just happened to play first. So we drove from Seattle down to Auburn, Washington, to this place called the White River Amphitheater. And so we got there, and my friend was really excited to see Dream Theater. They were one of his bands. Like I said, he loved all of this sort of, proggy, technical music. I didn't know too much about Dream Theater at the time. He had sort of tried to expose me to Dream Theater a little bit. He and I were really good friends at the time, and usually what our hangout sessions would include was we would usually go out and have some drinks at a bar somewhere, and then we would go back to his house, get a 12er, and basically he would play Rush bootlegs for me all night long until I had to catch the last bus home. But there were times when he would try to preach the gospel of Dream Theater to me. I was not really overly interested, so he and I went to go see the show at the White River Amphitheater in Seattle, and Dream Theater came out. And at first I was trying to, be positive. I was like, I love live music. I'll pretty much go see, almost anybody within reason. And about 5 minutes into Dream Theater's set, I could just feel my eyes glass over, and I just was so incredibly bored by everything they were doing. I don't know if you've ever experienced this where you're standing there, but you feel yourself falling asleep while you're standing. I literally felt myself nodding out as the band was playing. I could not have been any less interested in anything that they were doing. And what is the deal with the 15-minute long songs? I swear to God, they played an hour, and they probably played 3 songs. And of course, my friend next to me thought it was just Jim Dandy. But man, I could not get out of there soon enough, or they couldn't get off the stage soon enough, at least in my opinion. After they played, he and I went to go grab a drink before Iron Maiden came out, and he was just floating around. He was so ecstatic, and I literally was falling asleep, and he was trying to preach to me how amazing they were, and I was like, dude, I don't get it. After that, Iron Maiden came out and played. I'm not even an Iron Maiden fan, but anything after Dream Theater was absolutely amazing. Iron Maiden were cool. I'm not a big Iron Maiden fan. I know some of their songs. They were good live. If I had a criticism of seeing Iron Maiden live, this is a snippety criticism, but to me, Iron Maiden are almost too perfect live. There's no improvisation. They sound basically exactly like they do on the record. They were fine. I'm not a big Iron Maiden guy. As much as I don't like Dream Theater, I do have to say that there is a YouTube show called Talking Into Infinity, which I really like a lot. It's hosted by these 2 guys, John and Brian. The show is called Talking Into Infinity, where these 2 guys basically sit around and dweeb out on Dream Theater. And like I said, as much as I do not like Dream Theater, they are easily in my 8 least favorite bands of all time. I love shows on YouTube, sort of like what I fancy my Morrissey show to be like, where people sit around and just dweeb out on an artist they are really into. These 2 guys, John and Brian, do a great job talking about Dream Theater. I find their show way more interesting than I do Dream Theater. So go check out that show on YouTube, Talking to Infinity. If you're like me and you like to see, people dweeb out about music. But apart from that, if you are a fan of Dream Theater, I think you and I better go out into the street, remove our shirts, and exchange fisticuffs. Because that band is rough. All right, the next one on Morrissey's list is Kylie Minogue. Morrissey was sort of quoted as sarcastically saying that, yes, I'm sure she deserved it when Kylie Minogue was awarded the prestigious Order of the British Empire. Kylie Minogue is somebody that I remember being popular sort of sporadically throughout my life. I do remember when she was popular in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, I think. I do remember that she was pretty easy on the eyes. But apart from that, I don't really know much about her music. This is, an artist that I assume is just very, sort of a mall pop, probably like, Miley Cyrus, Steve, who you are apparently very close friends with. So I can't really form an opinion on Kylie Minogue. I'm not hugely familiar with her music. As I was sort of putting this week's episode together, I went and I listened to a couple of her popular songs off Spotify. I recognized them, but to me it's To me, she's nobody that's really, not saying she's not worth having an opinion over, but she's not somebody that I would get my panties, tweaked out all over. But, Morrissey. The next one I have on my list is a band, I think also this band is from New York. This band is called Rasputina. Now, this is a band that my wife claims to like, but I have not heard her listen to them much in the past. Her and I went to go see this band live in 2016. I have not heard her listen to them much since. Now, that show we went to in 2016 was probably the second worst show I've ever been to in my entire life. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Rasputina, to me, they are probably one of the most pompous and pretentious bands I've ever seen in my entire life. Now, my wife accuses me sometimes, as a Morrissey fan, of being pompous. But I told her after we went to go see Rasputina, you can never accuse me, or Morrissey, as an extension, of being pompous ever again. Not after I just sat through that. Now, there's a little bit of a backstory on the show that we went to go see. When we went to go see Rasputina, we saw them here in Nashville in 2016 at a venue called the Exit Inn, which is one of my favorite venues here in the city. My wife and I moved, this is our second time living in Nashville. We lived in Nashville back in 2016 for a year. We moved here from Oakland in 2016. At the time, my wife really did not want to leave the Bay Area. It was something that I actually sort of put the wheels in motion to. I sort of, put a little bit of pressure on her. I was very unhappy at the time in my work life. Now, it would have made much more sense for me just to find another job than it was to pack up and move cross country, especially when my girlfriend at the time, was not particularly excited about leaving the Bay Area. She really didn't want to come to Tennessee. We had come to Nashville to visit before I had been to Nashville. I came to Nashville the first time, I think it was in 2003, but I brought her here to sort of scout it out before we moved here, because I thought if she came and saw it, she would really fall in love with it, because at the time I really loved Nashville. I'm not saying I don't now, but we've lived here for so long, it's just home. So 2016, we moved to Nashville, and, in my defense, which I don't always defend myself, but in my defense, I thought that she was kind of on board with moving to Nashville. She at least paid lip service to the idea that she was okay with leaving. But it wasn't really until we got here that the truth really started to come out, and she was really unhappy living in Nashville. And her and I, because of that, I was liking Nashville. She was hating Nashville. There were a few other factors going on, but my wife and I were sort of at this point in our relationship where we were just having like a lot of problems. There was a lot of static. There was a time when I didn't even know if we were going to survive the static that we were going through. And around this time, my wife and I decided to go see this band, Rasputina. And like I said, her and I aren't necessarily on the best terms. We're sort of seeing the world in different ways. I think, things are sort of tugging us in two different directions. And this was a band I didn't really know much about at the time. Like I said, she claims that she's liked this band for a long time. I've never, apart from seeing them live, I don't think I've ever heard her listen to them because I would remember it. But we get to the Exit Inn in Nashville. Like I said, it's one of my favorite venues here in the city. And the first thing imagine walking through the door, the first thing you're hit with in the face is just 1,500 people's worth of the worst BO I've ever smelled. I think I left that show. I don't think I smelled right again for about 2 weeks. Anyway, the band came out, and this is, like I said, this has got to be one of the most pretentious bands of all time. It is consisted of 3 members, at least the show we saw. It was 2 cellos and a guy doing a beatbox. And the 2 cello players are dressed in sort of Victorian garb. And immediately when they came out on stage, not really knowing who they were, not knowing too much about them, I was completely disinterested. About 10 minutes into their set, I don't know if you've ever seen a band that you just dislike so much that they kind of make you angry. I started getting angry at this band. So as I sort of stood there and suffered through as much of it as I could. Eventually, I just sort of started walking around the venue because it's such a cool place. They have this wall behind the bar of all the bands that have ever played there. It's basically like a giant wall of fame. So I went over there. I was like reading the wall while this band is playing. I just could not take it. So I go up to the bar to order a beer. And the bartender, there's this sort of old crusty punk rock guy, or at least the bartender that night was. He's like, "Hey man, you enjoying the show?" And usually I'm not like this. Usually I try to put on a brave face. I was like, "Fucking no! This band sucks." Or no, I said, "No." He's like, "Yeah, man, this band sucks. Let's do a shot." So I bought a beer and we did a shot together and we toasted to this terrible band called Rasputina. At a certain point, I could just not take anymore. I actually left. I walked outside. I stood outside in like the smoking section. And I think I even texted my wife. I was like, "I'm outside. Have fun. I can't take it anymore." So for me, another one of my 8 most disliked bands of all time is Rasputina. If you have ever had the misfortune of seeing them live, my sympathies go out to you. And if you're a fan of them, whoo, doggy, I don't know what to tell you. The next one on Morrissey's list that I have written down is Kate Bush. Morrissey was quoted as to saying, "The best thing you can say about her is that she is intolerable." Wow. Like I said, Morrissey on a couple occasions does flex his talents in this article. He also says that her voice is complete drivel. Kate Bush is an artist I actually kind of like. She has sort of had a resurgence of popularity recently. I think it's due to, is it Stranger Things? I think that they have played some of her music on. I actually kind of like Kate Bush. I'm not the biggest expert on her. I don't know her entire catalog. But actually, I love her voice. I don't know what Morrissey's talking about when it comes to her voice. Yeah, some of her stuff that I've heard isn't necessarily my thing. But generally speaking, I actually kind of like Kate Bush. And I think it's kind of cool that she is, kind of, having a resurgence in popularity. I definitely think that she's better than a lot of the artists in her sort of style of music back in those days. So that's one I'm going to have to sort of disagree with you on there, Steve. The next one on my list, again, the only ones on my list that are in order are the top 3. So this is just another band that I thought about when I was thinking about 8 of my least favorite artists of all time. The next one I have written down is a Canadian band called Anvil. Now, I'm sure all of you nowadays are familiar with Anvil. They were a band that, sort of existed, in somewhat anonymity throughout most of the 1980s. This was a band, that is I'm not a big metal fan in general. I'm not really a huge heavy metal guy. But this was a band that had been around for a very long time, sort of, struggling through life, through their musical career until this film came out. I believe this was in 2009, I believe, when a filmmaker decided to make a film about this struggling Canadian metal band called Anvil. Now, at the time, a lot of people didn't really know who Anvil were. They were a band, like I said, they'd kind of been, struggling through the metal underground, throughout most of the 1980s. This was a band I actually, before this documentary came out, I actually sort of knew a little bit about who they were. I didn't know much about their music at all. But I at least had seen and heard the name, because when I was a kid, I grew up in California, but I spent my summers in Oregon with my grandparents, and I had a second cousin who lived in Oregon who I used to see a lot in the summer, and he was just a huge metal dude. And I do remember that he either liked Anvil or he knew who they were. I remember seeing something with their logo on it at one point in time. So when this movie came out, I was semi-interested in it. I watch every music documentary that I can possibly get my hands on. So I believe I went and saw this movie in the theater. I believe I saw it actually at the Seattle Film Festival. Now, if you haven't seen this movie, basically the film is about these 2 guys in this band. That is the drummer. His name is Rob Reiner. Not the guy that directed Stand By Me, by the way. And Lips, I don't know the rest of his name, doesn't really matter, but Lips, who is the guitarist and the singer. I love this documentary because it starts off where the band is playing at some sort of big festival. It might be the US Festival, but it might not be. Anyway, they're playing this big metal festival. It shows them on the stage, and it shows as they show this band Anvil playing. They also show all these other bands that they played with on that same day at that same festival. Now, every other band that they played with that day go on to become ultra successful, huge in the metal community. And this band Anvil is just sort of left behind. Now, the opening scene of the documentary then sort of goes into all of these artists who were, giving these testimonials about how great Anvil are and how they should have been huge, and they were the band that just kind of got left behind. And every time I watch this documentary, when I watch that part of all these people just praising this band and talking about how great they were, I think to myself, you're all lying, because this band is terrible. Now, after this documentary came out, the band basically. So, if you haven't seen the documentary, this documentary is just these two guys spend the entire duration of this film whining and crying that they aren't more popular. What's the running time on this? 80 minutes is the running time on this documentary. It feels like 80 years. These two guys are so unlikable. They are so entitled. They have this sort of strange, weird, undeserved ego about themselves. And really, they spend the entire documentary talking about how they cannot figure out how they did not become one of the biggest bands in the world. I think at one point in time, if this is the same documentary I'm thinking of, one of the two guys in the band compare themselves to like U2 and REM and the Rolling Stones and stuff like that. It's just really a tough watch. I remember one time I was talking to somebody about this band, and I was talking about how much I dislike this band, and my wife had never really, heard of them or seen anything about them, and she was like, "That's a weird band to hate. Why do you not like the band Anvil? I don't even know who they are." So I showed her this documentary, and about halfway through this documentary, she looked over at me. She's like, "Man, I hate these guys." So after the documentary comes out, it's a big hit. This band achieves, I think, ironically, they achieve some sort of, fame. I think it's basically sort of like reality TV fame. I don't think it's that people suddenly discovered how amazing this band was, because they aren't. So my friend and I, after this documentary comes out, the band goes out on tour, and my friend and I decided to go see him because he thinks it's going to be real funny. Now, this is the same guy I went to go see Dream Theater with. So looking back on it, I'm not sure how good of a friend he was, because he really steered me down some dark alleys, if you know what I mean. So he and I go to see Anvil live. We show up, I think it was at a place called Studio 7 in Seattle. It was either Studio 7 or El Corazon. I don't remember. But anyways, after the documentary came out, because I saw the documentary, and the band goes on tour, because now the band has this sort of, fame, sort of ironic, I think. So we go see them live, and we get there, and the place is relatively full. I don't think it was sold out, but there were definitely a few hundred, maybe 500 people there. And as I was walking around the show, I kind of got the sense, that most of the people there weren't there because they were, diehard Anvil fans. They were there to sort of take in the spectacle of the train wreck, which this documentary is. And the band came out and they started playing, and I almost felt like the people in the crowd were sort of like laughing at him in a way. In a way, I actually kind of felt bad for the guys in Anvil, because I don't think it was ever their music that won people over. I think it was what a train wreck their documentary is. And I'm not going to lie, my friend and I were there basically for the same reason. We thought it was going to be funny, but it really wasn't. I mean, going to see a very terrible band live is funny for about 10 minutes, and then you realize that you basically got taken, and I don't even think we made it through the whole show. I remember looking around at people, they were pointing and sort of chuckling, and these weren't even like metal fans. These were kind of like, film festival type people. I think they were there just to see the spectacle in person. It actually kind of made me feel bad for the guys in Anvil because like I said, I don't think the people were there to really sincerely listen to music. I couldn't take but a little bit of it. I don't think my friend and I even, stayed for the whole thing. And if you don't believe me that Anvil is, at least one of my least favorite bands of all time, go on YouTube and check out the video for the song "Nabbed in Nebraska." That has got to be one of the top 5 worst songs I've ever heard in my entire life. So for me, that's another band that's on my list. Anvil, if you have the opportunity to see them live, I would save your money. I think they're probably still out there, honestly. I mean, these guys are kind of like cockroaches. The next one on Morrissey's list is Elton John. This one surprised me because, Elton John is very iconic, although you could see Morrissey using that as an opportunity to take shots at him. Basically, Morrissey accuses him of trying to force himself upon the public, basically sharing TMI, being sort of a phony activist, somebody who shows up just to basically get his picture taken. I've heard people make the same accusations towards like Bono when he goes to Africa. For me, Elton John is somebody that was really great in the 1970s. And then as the 1980s started, he completely derailed. To me, I always tell people that to me, Elton John is like the white Stevie Wonder. You go back and listen to early Stevie Wonder records. I mean, enough said. Those are some of the greatest records ever made. But you get into the 1980s with Stevie Wonder, and man, it is nothing nice. That's the way I feel about Elton John. You go back and you listen to Elton John's early records, man, they are incredible. But at a certain point, Elton John just became a cartoon character. He became a caricature of himself. I would agree that he is insufferable in interviews. I'm not going to question his sincerity when it comes to, his activism and his charitable work. I'm not going to go that far. But he is somebody that just is completely in love with himself. It's really hard to stomach. So yeah, I'll go back and I'll listen to some old Elton John records. But anything from, 1980 to today is nothing nice. So I'm going to 50% agree with Morrissey on Elton John at least. The next one on my list is one that I don't really have any personal experience with or funny anecdote for you. I know you're probably relieved to hear that. For me, this one, again, they're not in order, but the next one for me is Culture Club / Boy George. I've never seen him live. I'm not going to go attack him personally. I've just never liked Culture Club. I don't really like Boy George. Even as a little kid, when I saw their videos on MTV, I didn't really like their music. I respect the fact and I understand the fact that Boy George, was a fashion icon in the 1980s. He was groundbreaking, and I respect all that. And I sort of respect, in some ways, what he stands for. But musically, and this is just about the music, man, I don't get it. My wife and I were in New York a couple weeks ago, and we went to go see Moulin Rouge on Broadway. And I was really happy we went when we did, because I actually really enjoyed Moulin Rouge a lot more than I expected to. We also went to go see Hadestown, which I liked as well. I liked Moulin Rouge a lot more. Actually, I didn't really expect to like either. I'm not really a musical theater type of person, but when we went to go see Moulin Rouge, the guy that played Ziegler, I think is the character's name, was just incredible. I can't even think of his name right now. But he was absolutely amazing. He was the best part of the whole show. My wife and I actually got really super nice tickets. I think they're called the can seats, where you're like in the stage. It was a great experience. It was a lot of fun. But the guy that played Ziegler was incredible. And not long after we saw the show, they were going to replace the guy that played Ziegler, at least temporarily. I don't really know how this musical theater stuff works. But Boy George was coming in to play Ziegler. And I remember telling my wife, and this isn't, again, it's not personal. I'm not trying to rail any of these people personally, but I was like, man, I'm so glad we didn't have to see Boy George, because the guy that played Ziegler was awesome. The next one on Morrissey's list is one that does not surprise me at all. It's Madonna. Morrissey basically accuses her of being the epitome of everything that is ridiculous and objectionable. He accuses her of organized harlotry. Not exactly sure what that means, but I really love the way it sounds. Nobody can string a few words together as well as Steve. I totally agree with this one. Actually, of all the artists, Morrissey and I don't have any in common, but of all the artists that we do have on our lists here, of our 8 artists that we would prefer not to be exposed to, Madonna is definitely the one on Morrissey's list that I agree with the most. I have never been a fan of Madonna. I do remember when I believe I was in high school, either late middle school or early high school, when Madonna released her video for the song Cherish. Now, this was at a point in time when my hormones were definitely raging. I was definitely in the grips of puberty and my body changing. And I remember the first time I saw the video for the song Cherish, my best friend and I were having a sleepover type thing. And we were watching MTV one night and the Cherish video came on. And I'll tell you something. Madonna was not very difficult to look at in that video. I loved that video so much that I went out and I bought a VHS copy of Madonna's Immaculate Collection, video collection on VHS, just to have that video. And I will tell you that every time I watched that video for probably about a year, it provided me with a substantial amount of bonage. I remember I would watch that video, rewind, watch that video, rewind, watch that video. Everything else I couldn't have possibly cared less about. But that Cherish video of her sort of, playing on the beach with the waves crashing around her, man, there was something about that I did not mind looking at. Apart from that, I've never liked Madonna's music. Now, personally, like I said, I don't want to make this anything personal. She is just not my luggage. I think that she is... one thing that annoys me about Madonna is her, her sort of lack of integrity and her self-obsession, which all of these people have self-obsession, but the fact that she's so obsessed with trying to stay relevant, at the end of the day, it kind of ends up making her look a little bit like a clown. And if you've seen any pictures of her lately, I actually kind of feel bad for her. I don't know what she has done to herself as far as, like the plastic surgery and all that. But yeah, she's somebody I've never been a fan of her music. Apart from that Cherish video, which I didn't hate back in middle school and high school for at least a while. I definitely agree with Morrissey on the Madonna topic. For me, the next one is just another artist I've never understood the appeal of. Somebody I absolutely do not understand, especially when you consider the level of their popularity. And that is Bruce Springsteen. Now, for one thing, I just don't like the guy's voice. I know that's sort of a generic criticism, but to me it always sounds like he's sitting on the can, trying to pass a watermelon. It just sounds like he's overly constipated. I've never liked his voice. I don't particularly like, his band. And I've just never been a fan of, like, America rock, like patriot rock, like, artists like Bruce Springsteen, John Cougar Mellencamp, Tom Petty, music like that. Now, Tom Petty gets a pass because Tom Petty at least was on King of the Hill, which is one of the greatest TV shows of all time. But I think the thing that bothers me the most about Bruce Springsteen is I just don't like his fake, blue collar, the guy who works on the assembly line, the blue collar pseudo poetry. I cannot stand it. He's a liar. He's a hypocrite. And that's one thing I just do not like in artists. I don't like people that are ingenuine. I doubt if Bruce Springsteen has ever worked on an assembly line. And if he ever did, he hasn't since the mid-'70s. So just like can it, all right, man? Honestly. I do not like his fake pseudo blue collar, America. He speaks for the working man. I don't get it. I remember, I think it was about a year or so ago, I was talking to a client of mine who was going to see Bruce Springsteen in New York, I think on Broadway. And he sort of, and this was sort of a passive-aggressive, status show-off, but the customer, or the client I was talking to, sort of casually dropped that he bought 2 tickets for Bruce Springsteen on Broadway for he and his wife, and the tickets were like $2,000 each. And of course he played it off like, I don't know, man, you gotta see Bruce. Like $2,000 to see that? $2,000, he better come rake my yard if he's the working man. I was completely appalled. I just don't like anything about Bruce Springsteen. I don't like his music. I don't like his fake, phony, blue collar. I'm the guy working in his car on the lawn with a beard. I just don't like it, and I've never liked that sort of, fake America patriot, rock. You can have it as far as I'm concerned. Fortunately, I've never seen Bruce Springsteen live. I probably couldn't afford to, even if I wanted to. Actually, I would never want to. But he's definitely on my list. The next one for Morrissey is Lady Gaga. Now, in the article, Morrissey describes having encountered Lady Gaga. He describes her as being a very lovely human being. Basically, he just isn't a big fan of her music. He accuses her of being very unrevolutionary, having to rely on all kinds of, effects and backup dancers and stage production to sort of make her music seem more passable. I think he basically accuses her of being, all meat, no sauce, or all sauce, no meat, I should say. And this is another artist that I'm not really overly familiar with. I remember when Lady Gaga was super popular, with the Paparazzi song. I do remember I had a friend at the time I worked with. She was a huge Lady Gaga fan. Her and I were friends for a little while, just friends. And, I remember that in her car, she used to listen to that CD all the time when we'd be driving around. Now, her and I quit being friends because she was a really terrible customer. I remember specifically, her and I had a day where we both got off early at the same time from work, and we would go out and have lunch together, and we'd kind of hang out, maybe have like a drink or two. At the time, I had a girlfriend, so it wasn't like we were dating. We were just friends. Man, she was like the worst customer I've ever been around. I can't deal with people that are bad customers. I've worked with the public basically my whole life, and if I go out with people that are really crappy customers, I'll give them like one pass. Beyond that, I get really uncomfortable. I quit hanging out with this person just because she was such a terrible customer. But I remember she was really into Lady Gaga. It was around the time that, that record was popular, the one with Paparazzi. I don't mind Lady Gaga. I would definitely take her over Madonna. I think that she is at least doing something that's interesting. She's not just, your empty-headed pop star. So I can't really say that I am a fan. I wouldn't say I'm a fan. I don't know enough to be a fan or not a fan. But I respect Lady Gaga, so I'm going to sort of disagree with Steve on that one. For me now, we are into the top 3, and these 3 are in order as far as I'm concerned. These are my 3 least favorite artists of all time. For me, number 3 is a band that is probably more popular today than they've ever been, which just completely baffles me, and that is Motley Crue. This is a band that I've never liked. And there's really only one reason why I don't like Motley Crue. Let's be honest. And that reason is that they are not good. Why is this band more popular today than I think they've ever been? It's not just that they are a bad band. I can live with that. There were a lot of bad bands from that era, of that style of music in the mid to late 80s with the hair metal stuff. There's a lot of objectionable bands that came out of that scene, but none more, in my opinion, than Motley Crue. I mean, these guys are not only a bad band, these are like bad people, man. I mean, Nikki Sixx is a narcissistic moron. Vince Neil killed somebody. Literally killed somebody. Tommy Lee is a convicted domestic abuser. And yet, this band is out there selling out stadiums, not arenas, mind you. They came to Nashville last summer. Now, granted, they played with Def Leppard, who are a huge band, and Poison, who I think have a couple fans, and Joan Jett, who probably brought a couple people in. But they played the NFL Stadium here in Nashville this summer, and it sold out. Yet people want to cancel Morrissey for saying things that they don't agree with. Vince Neil literally killed somebody. So it's true what some people say that is thought of as being cynical sometimes, which it is literally worse to hurt somebody's feelings than it is to kill somebody. Vince Neil killed somebody, literally. And this band is probably more popular today than ever. Back in the early 2000s, I had a girlfriend, and she was quite a lovely gal. Her and I were together for 5 years. I still have very fond memories of her. Our relationship, as we sort of grew older together, we sort of grew apart. It happens. It wasn't a happy circumstance, but it was something that happened. Our relationship ended, I would say, rather amicably, at least as amicably as possible, but she's somebody I still have a lot of fond memories of. She was really the only one of my exes that I stayed relatively friends with, as much as you can. We don't talk very often, or at all really anymore, but her favorite band of all time was Motley Crue. And this was something that I was not completely in love with, but it was something that I tolerated. I mean, she didn't necessarily like all the music I liked. I didn't necessarily like all the music that she liked. But we had some music in common, and at one point in time, it was announced that Motley Crue were coming to our area, and she was just beyond excited. She had not seen them live in many years. She was very excited to go. She listened to Motley Crue all the time. She had Motley Crue tattoos. I mean, she was all in. And I remember, as this show was announced, I was like, man, I don't want to go see Motley Crue. But it was something that she was very excited about. So, you bite the bullet, you go down there, you buy the tickets, you get ready to go. And I remember talking to somebody who had seen them live, and they're like, man, they're so good live. You're going to love it. So the day comes, and we get down to the show, and I'm kind of looking around, and I'm feeling a little bit smug, I must admit. But I get down there, I'm kind of looking around at the people, around me, and I'm thinking to myself, man, the trailer parks must be empty tonight. But after a little while, I realized that I'm being kind of, I'm being a little bit snobby. I'm sort of being a wet blanket. I look over at my girlfriend, and she's so excited. She's just so happy to be there, to see her band live. And I remember really checking myself, being like, all right, I need to be happy for her. I can have a good time. I love going to shows. It can't be that bad. I mean, it's going to be fun. And, they can't possibly be as bad as I think they're going to be. They were worse than I could have ever possibly imagined. I mentioned earlier, the second worst show I've ever been to in my entire life was that band Rasputina here in Nashville. But the worst show I've ever been to, ever, was seeing Motley Crue. Now, I don't remember the name of the band that opened for them, but I remember it was one of those, sort of fashion-core screamo bands. And all those bands nowadays, they all kind of, blend together. They all had, the look. I don't remember who it was. They weren't bad. They were way better than Motley Crue was. But I remember at a certain point in the show, the singer of that band's like, who's here to fuck Nikki Sixx? And of of course, all these like sad spandex moms like, ooh, and I remember looking around, I was like, man, there's a lot of low-hanging udders in this crowd here tonight. But man, were they terrible. And I know it's become a thing now. It's a known thing now with Vince Neil that he can't sing. I mean, I don't know that he ever could sing, but he can't sing. And this was sort of before, or at least I had known that. So he comes out on stage just like doing the voice thing that he does. Like, and I just don't even like his voice. I don't even like the tone of his voice. And to me, the band can't play. They write moronic songs. And live, every song sounded exactly the same. I couldn't make out a note of any song. I didn't recognize any song. And I had been with this girl for years. She listened to Motley Crue all the time. I probably knew half their catalog by heart. But every song was like dug 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 dug. And I remember talking to somebody before I went, and I was like, man, I don't want to go see Motley Crue. And this guy told me, he's like, yeah, man. He's like, they're pretty rough, but he's like, one thing that you have to check out is Tommy Lee. Watch Tommy Lee. He's entertaining. He's a great drummer. And the whole time I'm keeping that in mind, watching the show, watching Tommy Lee, saying, okay, when's he going to be a great drummer? He's not beating the Skins half as good as he beats his wife. Man, that was a show that gave me post-traumatic stress, seeing Motley Crue live. I mean, holy smokes. And that's another thing about Motley Crue that just bothers me. It's just like I said earlier, they're just like these terrible people. You know, it's one thing in the 80s to play that style of music, to be in your 20s, to be just these horrendous human beings. But when you're in your 60s, and it's 2024, and you're still like that, you know, sleazeball in Motley Crue, it's sad. It makes me sad when I see like a Tommy Lee and Vince Neil, Nikki Sixx. I don't even know the other guy's name. It's a new guy now. I know they kicked Mick Mars out for getting too old or whatever. But man, if you ever have a chance to go see Motley Crue, I would pass. And if you're one of those people, and I do this all the time, if you're one of those people who ever wonders if you're an idiot. Now, people that are idiots don't often wonder if they're idiots. It's like usually the people that have like the fewest redeeming qualities always have the highest self-esteem. But if you are one of those people like me who wonders if I'm an idiot, although I'm pretty sure that I am most of the time, there's a really simple, easy way to find out the answer. And that is, if you were buying tickets to go see Motley Crue, yes, you're an idiot. All right. The next one on Morrissey's list was one that did not surprise me at all. This is one that is sort of a long-running feud among Morrissey fans. It's kind of a known thing, and that is The Cure. Morrissey in this article accused The Cure's landmark album Disintegration as being truly disgusting. He went on to say that they've introduced an entirely new depth to the word filth. The Morrissey Robert Smith thing is something that goes way back. This is something that I kind of enjoy as a Morrissey Smith fan. I enjoy the rivalry. Now, I am a Cure fan. I'm a casual Cure fan. I really like a lot of the stuff in their early, catalog. At a certain point, the Cure sort of lose me. I do like that album Disintegration a lot. I know that's a real generic opinion, but I love Disintegration. At a certain point, the Cure sort of lose me. And, Robert Smith nowadays, although he is still great live, I don't necessarily think that the Cure are making records that are anywhere near as good as Morrissey is. But I've always kind of liked the Cure, Morrissey, Smiths rivalry. I don't necessarily participate in it. I own a lot of Cure records. I'm a big fan of the early stuff. I would say that my favorite Cure record is easily Head on the Door. I went to go see The Cure. I've only seen The Cure live once. I saw them, I think it was in like 2000. I was living in Seattle, and I went with a coworker, and her and I were friends. Again, it was a female coworker, but we were just friends. We were really good friends at work. We had a lot of the same sort of musical taste, and The Cure were coming up to play at a place in Washington called The Gorge, east of Seattle. sort of out in the mountainous part of the state. Now, if you've never been to the Gorge in Washington, man, that place is unbelievable. It is probably the most beautiful amphitheater I've ever been to. I haven't done Red Rocks yet, which is something I have to do. But the Gorge is just incredible. So it's the thing, you go up there, you camp, you spend the night, you go see the show, you party at night. It's supposed to be a great time. That was my first time I ever actually went to the Gorge. So I met up with this girl and some of her friends. You know, her and I were work friends, but she brought along some of her real friends. And I didn't really know her very well. But her and, we filled up a couple of cars of people. We drove up to the Gorge. We were going to go see The Cure. We camped out. And in pretty short order, I could tell that her and her friends were some of the worst human beings I've ever met. And this was really the only time her and I ever hung out outside of work, because I got around her and her real friends, and she was just a wretched person. She was starting fights with people. She was one of those people that just talk shit about everybody in the world, didn't say a positive word about anything or anybody. And as we went to the show to see The Cure, I was so distracted by how annoying these people were around me that I couldn't really even focus on the show. I do remember liking the show, and The Cure are great live. So, that was my only time I ever got to see The Cure. But I am a semi-fan, so I'm going to disagree with you on that one, Steve. At least 50%. I really like 50% of The Cure's music. The one thing I'll say about Robert Smith, and I know, like Morrissey, some people say that it's Robert Smith's voice that they have a hard time with. I like Robert Smith's voice a lot. The one thing I don't love about Robert Smith's voice is when he does the thing on his voice, he does this affect sometimes. You can really hear it on the song, like, Why Can't I Be You? Where he kind of goes like, why can't I be you? And he kind of really throws his voice open. I don't love when he does that. But I would say I'm a casual Cure fan for sure. Number 2, like I said, my top 3 are in order. So number 2 for me is somebody that, this probably isn't entirely fair because it isn't really on them so much. But my number 2 is Sammy Hagar. For one thing, like I said earlier with Bruce Springsteen, I just don't really like generic Patriot America rock. Songs about Camaros and the American flag. Which is, that's kind of, Sammy Hagar's luggage, and it's fine, like I said. To me, Sammy Hagar is not a good singer. He's not a good songwriter. But from everything I've heard and read from people, he is a nice enough guy. My problem with Sammy Hagar doesn't really have a lot to do with him. I've never seen him live. I think he sucks. But apart from that, my problem with Sammy Hagar is an association thing. When I was in college, I had a roommate. I've mentioned in the past, I lived for a while in a house with a bunch of dudes. One of my roommates in college was this guy who was obsessed with Sammy Hagar. That was his boy. And like I said earlier in this video, I've tried to shed most of my negativity in the world. I really try to make a conscious effort to avoid using the word hate as much as possible in my daily conversations. But I would say there's 2 people in the world right now that I genuinely hate. One of which is a boss I had when I lived up in Milwaukee. That's a whole story you don't need to hear about. And the other one is this guy that I was roommates with all the way back in college, and I have not seen him since. But he was such a horrible person that almost 30 years later, I still genuinely hate this guy. So my association with why Sammy Hagar is my number 2 is probably more because of this guy I knew in college man, just the worst person I've ever had to spend, a significant amount of time with. So sorry, Sammy Hagar, but you're my number 2. It's just going to have to be that way. And I Can't Drive 55 is probably one of the worst songs of all time. So I'll just say that. All right. The last one for Morrissey on his 8 artists he hates from the heart is dumb. It's David Bowie. Stupid. David Bowie is basically God. David Bowie is my second favorite recording artist of all time, only behind the big guy. And I believe that this is something that's personal. I know at a certain point in time, Morrissey and David Bowie had a tremendous amount of respect and affection for each other. I think this feud goes back to, I think it was like 1995 when Morrissey did some shows opening for David Bowie. I think that's when their, relationship hit speed bumps. Basically, Morrissey in this piece accuses, David Bowie of losing his authenticity, basically becoming a puppet, trying to pander to the lowest common denominator within the musical fan base. I think it's completely ridiculous. I think that Morrissey knows he's being completely ridiculous. Yes, in the early 2000s, there were a couple Bowie records, Hours and Reality in particular, that I'm not completely infatuated with. But I mean, come on, Steve. David Bowie is basically musical perfection. In my opinion, like I said, he's my second favorite recording artist of all time. This is personal. This reeks of something happened. I've talked on these videos about my best friend in California, Tim. He and I have experienced some rocky seas in our friendship. And during those times, yes, I've been capable of saying some things about him that were less than flattering. So I think that this is a personal thing. I mean, honestly, I can't even really... I'm dignifying it with comment now, but you can't even really dignify this. I mean, you're wrong, Steve. David Bowie, one of the 8 artists you dislike the most. Sorry. For me, my number one... before I get to my number one, I have to tell you that there are 2 songs that I consider to be the worst songs of all time. One being a song by Trace Adkins called Honky Tonk Badunka-Dunk. Recorded, guess where? Right here in Nashville, Tennessee. I remember the first time I heard the song Honky Tonk Badunka-Dunk. My wife and I were in a store here in Nashville. I think it was when we lived here the first time back in 2016. You go into a store or a coffee shop or wherever and music's playing, and it doesn't really necessarily stick to you. It's just kind of background noise. And as the song started playing, I couldn't not listen to it. I basically became completely obsessed with it immediately. It's Nashville at its worst. Now, admittedly, I'm not the biggest country music fan, but I do believe that there's a lot of great music here in Nashville. I'm not a big fan of the, especially the pop country. Now, my wife is really into, Americana, alt country, old-timey kind of string music. Her favorite band of all time is a band called the Lost Dog Street Band. I like stuff like that enough. I actually think some of that stuff is sort of the, reincarnation of punk rock in a lot of ways. But as I was listening to this song, Honky Tonk Badunka-Dunk, I could not believe that it was a real thing. I don't know if you've ever heard a song that was so bad that you thought it had to be fake. This can't be real. This isn't like a real song. Sure enough, it is a real song. And I remember the next day I was at work and I was telling somebody, I was like, I heard this song that I cannot my brain just cannot let go of this song. It's called Honky Tonk Badunka-Dunk. And this guy from across the room yells out, I love that song, man! Welcome to Nashville. Now, that song is by Trace Adkins, and of course, he didn't write the song. I mean, here in Nashville, it takes 3 songwriters to write, a masterpiece like Honky Tonk Badunka-Dunk. But I don't know enough about Trace Adkins to put him in my, list of 8 least favorite artists of all time. But I will say that the other worst song of all time that I've ever heard in my entire life is a song called Love in an Elevator by the Boston Bad Boys, Aerosmith. I first heard this song when it came out on MTV. I was probably in middle school. And I remember even as a middle school lad thinking to myself, this is really terrible. And it hasn't gotten any better. And for me, Aerosmith are my number 1 least favorite band of all time. To me, they are just the most generic bar rock, overly celebrated, overly hand-jobbed band of all time. And at least in my opinion, They are responsible for one of the two worst songs ever recorded, which is the song Love in an Elevator. Now, for many, many years, I have disliked Aerosmith. It's been this thing with me. I've disliked Aerosmith longer than I've liked a lot of the music that I like. And for many, many years, I was very outspoken about my disdain for Aerosmith. In particular, Steven Tyler. It was such a thing that I became known for it. And people would ask me my opinions, or they would, they'd buy me a postcard with Steven Tyler on it as a joke gift. And as, social media became a thing, and I first got on, I think I was on MySpace, it became a thing, where people, anytime Steven Tyler was in the news or Aerosmith put out a new record, they would send me something because they would want to get my over-the-top, nasty, ugly reaction to it. And it got to the point where, I don't like Aerosmith. I think they're terrible. I really think they're like the worst band of all time. But they're not, I'm sure they're not bad guys. I have nothing personal against Steven Tyler, Joe Perry, or any of the guys in that band. And it got to the point where honestly, I just kind of got tired of being known for having this like really horrible, negative opinion. I've said things about Steven Tyler that were like way over the line, looking back on it. So, like I said at the beginning, I don't really want to get negative about this. This is just kind of a fun topic, of music that I don't like. Most of the time I focus, on music that I do like. But I would say that for me, my least favorite band of all time, it's been like this probably, since I first heard that song, Love in an Elevator, back when I was in middle school. My wife and I were up in New York a couple weeks ago, I mentioned. And we were out at a bar. It's funny, in New York, all the bars and restaurants in New York right now, they play music from like the late 80s, early 90s rock. Whether it's like, the hair metal stuff or into sort of like grunge, it's like a big thing. I guess my wife is telling me it's a big thing with young people now. It's like a sort of coming back into fashion. It's weird when you get older, you see things come back into fashion. But we were out one night, I think we were out in Brooklyn at that metal bar, and the song Love in an Elevator came on, and I didn't really say anything about it because my wife and her friend were having a conversation, so I was sitting there listening to it, remembering that I think it's one of the two worst songs of all time. And I hadn't heard it in years. I don't seek it out. It's not something that I, punish myself with very often. I remember listening to it a couple weeks ago, and I was like, yeah, this is still one of the worst songs of all time. One of the top two, Love in an Elevator and Honky Tonk Badonkadonk. And if you haven't heard Honky Tonk Badonkadonk, consider yourself lucky. But if you ever do something that you're really ashamed of, and you feel like, man, I need to punish myself today, go out and check out a little Trace Adkins Honky Tonk Badonkadonk. That should do the trick. You'll definitely feel a lot worse for having heard it. I promise you that. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. If you liked this video, be sure to check back every week for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and The Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. I realized that this video got a little bit long-winded. I was afraid it might. This was a topic that I had a feeling I was going to have a lot of fun with, and I did. And I hope you did as well. So until next time, my friends, I'll talk to you then.